I'm 42 years old, and what happened to me on August 7th, 2017, in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest changed everything I thought I knew about the world. For the past 3 years, I've kept this secret locked away, terrified of what would happen if anyone found out. But silence has its own weight, and I've carried this burden long enough. My name is Nathan Reeves, and I need to tell you about the day I saved a baby Bigfoot from drowning, and what its mother did that still keeps me awake at night. I should start by explaining who I was before that day. I worked as a wilderness survival instructor for a company called Pacific Northwest Expeditions based out of Troutdale, Oregon. We ran courses teaching people basic survival skills, primitive fire making, shelter construction, water purification, that sort of thing. I'd been doing it for 8 years, ever since I left my desk job in Seattle and decided I needed something that felt more real, more connected to the earth. The irony isn't lost on me now. I thought I understood the wilderness. I thought I knew what was out there. That summer had been brutally hot. The Pacific Northwest was experiencing a heat wave that had meteorologists comparing it to records from the Dust Bowl era. Temperatures in Portland hit 108 degrees. Seattle reached 104. The forests were tinder dry, and fire warnings were posted everywhere. Several smaller wildfires had already broken out across Washington and Oregon, keeping firefighting crews working around the clock. I was leading a 5-day advanced survival course with 6 students. We'd started on August 4th, deep in the Gifford-Pinchot, about 15 miles from the nearest logging road. The plan was to teach advanced skills like debris shelter construction, primitive trapping techniques, and long-distance navigation without GPS. My students ranged from a 23-year-old fresh out of college who wanted to prove something to himself, to a 56-year-old attorney from Sacramento who'd always dreamed of living off the grid. By August 7th, we were 3 days into the course. The heat had followed us into the forest, unusual for an area that typically stayed temperate even in summer. We'd set up our base camp near a creek called Snowshoe Creek, one of dozens of small tributaries that fed into the Lewis River. The creek was running lower than I'd ever seen it, reduced to maybe 2 feet wide in most places, barely 6 inches deep. But it was cold, fed by snowmelt from Mount Adams, and it provided the only relief from the oppressive heat. That morning started normally enough. I woke the students at 6:30 while the air was still relatively cool. We did our morning routine, checking our supplies, discussing the day's lesson plan. I'd planned to teach them about edible plants in the area, how to identify false lily of the valley from true Solomon seal, which mushrooms were safe and which would shut down your kidneys. We'd also work on their shelter building skills, since I'd noticed a couple of them had constructed debris huts that would collapse in any serious wind. Around 9:30, after we'd eaten breakfast, dehydrated oatmeal with dried berries and nuts, I took 3 of the students downstream to look at a grove of western red cedar, where I wanted to demonstrate bark harvesting techniques. The other 3 stayed at camp with instructions to improve their shelters. I told them I'd be back in an hour. The grove was about 1.5 miles downstream, following the creek's winding path through dense forest of Douglas fir and hemlock. The air was already warming up, had to be pushing 85 degrees, and I was sweating through my shirt. My students were quiet, focused, following in single file along the game trail that paralleled the water. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, just the sound of our boots on the soft earth, the creek burbling over stones, ravens calling in the distance. We reached the cedar grove around 10:15. I was showing the students how to identify the layered bark, explaining that indigenous peoples had harvested it for thousands of years for baskets and clothing, when I heard something that made me stop mid-sentence. It was a sound I'd never heard before in all my years in the woods, high-pitched. almost like a child crying, but not quite human, more guttural, more desperate. It was coming from downstream, maybe 200 yards away. The students heard it too. "What is that?" asked Jennifer, the 23-year-old. "Some kind of animal." "I'm not sure," I said, already moving toward the sound. "Stay here. I'm going to check it out." "Shouldn't we come with you?" asked Marcus, one of the other students, a 38-year-old engineer from Portland. "No. If it's a bear cub or something injured, the last thing we need is a group of people spooking it. Just wait here. If I'm not back in 15 minutes, head back to camp and use the satellite phone to call base." I left them there and moved quickly along the creek, following the sound. It was getting louder, more frantic. The crying had a quality that triggered something primal in me, that instinct that makes you want to help something in distress. I'd heard injured animals before, deer caught in fences, a raccoon with its leg in a trap once. This was different. This had an intelligence to it, a desperation that sounded almost human. The creek made a sharp bend ahead, curving around a large outcropping of basalt rock. The sound was coming from just beyond that bend. I slowed down, approaching carefully, not knowing what I'd find. A mother bear with cubs, an injured cougar. In wilderness work, you learn to respect the fact that helping an injured animal can get you killed faster than almost anything else. I rounded the bend and stopped dead in my tracks. The creek widened here, forming a small pool maybe 15 feet across and 4 feet deep at the center. The water was flowing faster than it had been upstream, channeled through a narrow gap in the rocks, creating a mild current. And in the middle of that pool, struggling to keep its head above water, was something that should not exist. It was small, maybe 3 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown fur that was matted and soaked. The arms were too long, the proportions all wrong for any animal I knew. And the face, when it turned toward me with those panicked eyes, was unmistakably primate. Not a bear cub, not a young gorilla, even though there were no gorillas within thousands of miles. This was something else entirely. Even in that first shocking moment, my brain supplied the word I'd never believed in. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, a juvenile one, and it was drowning. The creature's head went under for a moment, then broke the surface again with a desperate gasp. Its arms were flailing, trying to grab onto something, anything, but the smooth basalt offered no purchase. I could see it was exhausted, barely able to keep fighting. Maybe it had been in the water for a while, swept into this pool by the current and unable to climb out. I didn't think. There was no time for logic or disbelief or fear. Something was drowning in front of me, and I've never been able to walk away from that. I dropped my pack, kicked off my boots, and waded into the pool. The water was shockingly cold against my overheated skin. I pushed off and swam the few strokes to reach the struggling creature. Up close, it was even more impossible. The fur was thick, coarse, not like any animal I'd touched. The face was expressive in a way that was deeply unsettling, almost human, but not quite. The eyes, dark brown and wide with terror, locked onto mine. It made that crying sound again, louder now, right in front of me. And then it did something that nearly made me let go. It reached for me, not with the blind panic of a drowning animal, but deliberately, the way a child would reach for an adult to save them. I grabbed it, one arm around its torso, and immediately understood why it had been struggling so much. It was heavy, far heavier than a 3-foot-tall creature should be, had to weigh at least 70 or 80 pounds of solid muscle and dense bone. I kicked toward the edge of the pool, my free arm pulling against the water, and the creature clung to me with surprising strength, its arms wrapping around my neck, legs around my waist. We reached the shallow edge, and I half climbed, half crawled onto the rocky bank, the creature still holding on to me. I could feel it trembling, could feel its chest heaving with rapid breaths against mine. I sat there in the shallows for a moment, water streaming off both of us, trying to process what had just happened. I'd just saved a Bigfoot, a baby Bigfoot, something that according to science and rational thought should not exist. The creature loosened its grip and pulled back slightly, looking at me. Its face was covered in wet fur, but I could see its features clearly. A small nose, very flat, a prominent brow ridge even at this young age. The mouth was larger than a human child's, and when it made another sound, softer now, I could see teeth that were definitely not human. But the eyes, the intelligence in those eyes was unmistakable. It was looking at me not like an animal looks at a human, but like a person looks at another person. "Hey," I said softly, not knowing what else to say. "You're okay now. You're safe." It tilted its head slightly, and I had the uncanny sense it understood the tone, if not the words. One small hand, and they were hands with opposable thumbs and individual fingers, reached up and touched my face. The gesture was so gentle, so curious, that I felt my throat tighten. This was not an animal. This was something far more complex. That's when I heard the sound that made my blood run cold. A roar, if you can call it that. Deep, resonant, filled with rage and terror. It came from somewhere in the forest behind me, maybe 100 yards away. The trees themselves seemed to vibrate with the force of it. And I knew with absolute certainty that the mother was coming. The creature in my arms heard it too. Its whole body tensed, and it made a responding call, higher pitched but clearly communicative. A response, a signal. I'm here, I'm alive. And that call was bringing something large and powerful and probably very angry in our direction. I stood up quickly, water streaming from my clothes. My mind was racing. I was unarmed except for the small folding knife on my belt, which would be useless against anything large enough to make a sound like that. I could try to run, but I was exhausted from the swim, weighed down by wet clothes, and had no idea how fast these creatures could move through their own forest. Plus, I was holding the baby. If I put it down and ran, what would the mother think? That I'd hurt it? That I was a threat? The roar came again, closer now. I could hear something moving through the underbrush, branches snapping, heavy footfalls. The baby in my arms made another sound, this one seeming almost worried. It was looking past me toward the sound of its mother approaching. I made a decision that seemed insane even as I was making it. I slowly, carefully knelt down and placed the baby on the ground at the edge of the creek. It looked up at me, confused, and reached for me again with those small hands. "Go to your mother," I said quietly. "Go on, she's coming for you." The baby hesitated, looking between me and the direction of the approaching sounds. Then it took a few unsteady steps away from me, wobbling slightly. It was exhausted from its time in the water, I realized. It might not even be able to walk properly yet. It took another step and its legs gave out. It sat down hard on the rocky ground and made a crying sound. The mother's roar came again, and this time I could hear it was very close, maybe 50 yards away. I could hear the rhythm of movement, something large pushing through dense vegetation with single-minded purpose. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I stayed there, standing between the baby and the forest edge, my hands raised and open, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. And then she emerged from the tree line, and every rational thought in my head simply stopped. She was massive, had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe 8.5. Shoulders broader than any human, arms that looked like they could tear a tree in half. Her fur was darker than the baby's, a deep brown that was almost black in places, and she moved with a kind of power that was terrifying to witness. This was a creature that had never known a predator, that had never had to fear anything in these forests. She saw me immediately, and her eyes, the same deep brown as her baby's, locked onto mine with an intensity that made my knees weak. She took 2 steps forward, and I could see every muscle in her body tensed, ready to charge. ready to destroy the threat to her offspring. Her lips pulled back, revealing large teeth, canines that could tear through flesh like paper. She raised herself up even taller, making herself as large and intimidating as possible, and let out another roar that I felt in my chest, like a physical blow. I didn't move. I stood there with my hands up, palms forward, and forced myself to meet her eyes. I've read that with most predators, you should never make direct eye contact. It's seen as a challenge. But something in my gut told me this was different. This creature wasn't acting on instinct alone. There was intelligence there, and intelligence responds to different signals than instinct. I needed her to see that I wasn't a threat, that I wasn't trying to hurt her baby. I helped him, I said, keeping my voice calm and low. He was drowning in the creek. I pulled him out. That's all. I'm not going to hurt him. She stopped her advance, maybe 20 feet away from me now. Her head tilted slightly, and I had the sense she was evaluating me, trying to understand what I was doing. The baby, hearing its mother so close, let out a plaintive cry and tried again to stand. It managed to get to its feet, wobbling, and took 2 stumbling steps toward her. The mother's attention shifted to her baby, and the change in her expression was remarkable. The rage and aggression melted into something else: concern, relief. She moved forward and I stepped aside, giving her a clear path to her offspring. She swept past me close enough that I could smell her, a musky, earthy scent like a forest floor after rain. She knelt down and gathered the baby into her arms, holding it close, making soft vocalizations that sounded like crooning, like comfort. The baby responded, pressing its face into its mother's fur, its small arms wrapping around her neck. The mother examined it carefully, running her hands over its body, checking for injuries. She touched the wet fur, looked at the creek, then looked at me. And in that moment, I saw the understanding in her eyes. She knew what had happened. She knew I'd pulled her baby from the water. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. Me, standing there, dripping wet, exhausted, probably in shock. Her holding her baby, this impossible creature that wasn't supposed to exist. The forest around us was silent, as if the birds and insects were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then she did something I will never forget for as long as I live. Still holding the baby with one arm, she reached out with her free hand and touched my shoulder. Not aggressively, not with threat, just a simple touch, her hand resting on my shoulder for perhaps 3 seconds. The weight of it was substantial, the hand large enough to completely cover my shoulder and partway down my upper arm. I could feel the warmth of it through my wet shirt, and then she withdrew the hand, looked at me one more time with those impossibly intelligent eyes and turned away. She walked back toward the tree line, moving with a kind of grace that seemed impossible for something so large. The baby's head was visible over her shoulder, and as they reached the edge of the forest, the baby looked back at me. Our eyes met for just a second, and then they were gone, disappearing into the dense undergrowth as if they'd never been there at all. The sounds of their passage faded quickly, and within 30 seconds the forest was silent again, except for the murmur of the creek and my own heavy breathing. I stood there for what might have been 5 minutes, might have been 20. Time felt strange, elastic. My legs were shaking, my hands were trembling. I looked down at my shoulder where the mother had touched me, half expecting to see some mark, some evidence that it had really happened. There was nothing, just my wet shirt clinging to my skin. Slowly, I walked back to where I'd left my pack and boots. I sat down on a rock and tried to process what had just happened. I'd always been a rational person, grounded in scientific reality. I'd heard the Bigfoot stories, of course. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, you couldn't avoid them. But I'd always dismissed them as myths, misidentifications, people seeing bears and imagining something more exotic. The evidence had never been convincing. Blurry photographs, footprint casts that could be faked, anecdotal stories that proved nothing, but I'd just held one. I'd felt its weight, seen its face up close, looked into its eyes, and I'd seen its mother, a creature that stood 8 feet tall and moved through the forest like a shadow. This wasn't a hoax or a misidentification. This was real, which meant everything I thought I knew about zoology, about North American wildlife, about what was possible, was wrong. I pulled on my boots with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. My students were waiting for me, probably worried by now. I'd been gone longer than 15 minutes, but how could I go back and tell them what I'd seen? Who would believe me? I had no evidence, no photographs, nothing but a wet shirt and a story that sounded like pure fantasy. As I shouldered my pack and started walking back toward the cedar grove, I tried to construct an explanation that wouldn't sound insane. I'd say I heard an animal in distress, went to check it out, found nothing. Maybe a deer had been stuck and freed itself before I arrived. Something plausible, something normal, because the alternative, telling the truth, would mean questions I couldn't answer, investigations I didn't want. And more than that, it would mean bringing attention to these creatures, to their habitat, to their existence. After what I'd just experienced, after that moment when the mother touched my shoulder in what I could only interpret as gratitude, I felt an overwhelming responsibility to protect their secret. I reached the cedar grove to find my 3 students looking anxious. "Nathan, there you are," Jennifer said, relief evident in her voice. "We were about to head back to camp. You've been gone almost half an hour. What happened?" "Sorry about that," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I heard what I thought was an animal in distress, tracked it downstream for a while. Turned out to be nothing, probably just a weird echo off the rocks. How are you all doing? Anyone need a water break?" They accepted the explanation without question. Why wouldn't they? I was the instructor, the expert. I had no reason to lie. We spent another 30 minutes at the grove, and I went through the cedar bark demonstration on autopilot, my mind elsewhere, replaying every second of what had happened. The feel of that baby's weight in my arms, the intelligence in its eyes, the mother's roar, that touch on my shoulder. We hiked back to base camp around noon. The heat was brutal now, probably approaching 95 degrees, even in the shade of the forest. The other 3 students had made good progress on their shelters, and we spent the afternoon refining their construction techniques. I moved through the activities mechanically, teaching, correcting, encouraging, all while my mind kept returning to that pool, those creatures, that impossible encounter. That evening, after we'd eaten dinner around the campfire, beef jerky and rice cooked over coals, one of the students, a 40-year-old woman named Patricia, who worked as a nurse in Eugene, asked me about local wildlife. "Have you ever seen anything really unusual out here? I mean, in all your years doing this?" The question caught me off guard. I must have hesitated too long because she laughed. "Sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot. I was just curious. My brother's really into cryptozoology, always talking about Bigfoot and stuff. I think it's nonsense, but he insists they're out here somewhere." "What do you think?" I asked, deflecting the question. "Do you believe in Bigfoot?" "God, no," she said, and the others laughed. "I mean, we'd have found one by now, right? Dead body, bones, something. You can't have a breeding population of 8-foot-tall apes running around the Pacific Northwest without someone getting real evidence. It's just not possible." I nodded, poked at the fire with a stick. "You're probably right." "Probably," she smiled. "Come on, Nathan. You've spent more time in these woods than almost anyone. You've never seen anything weird?" "Define weird," I said. "I saw a cougar drag a full-grown elk up a tree once. That was pretty weird. Saw a bear cub riding on its mother's back like a backpack. That was weird. Nature's weird enough without needing to invent mythical creatures." The conversation moved on to other topics, but I felt the weight of the lie. I'd just looked this woman in the eye and dismissed the existence of something I'd held in my arms 6 hours earlier. But what choice did I have? If I told the truth, she'd think I was crazy, or she'd believe me, and then what? A media circus? Researchers flooding into the forest? Hunters looking for trophies? The creatures I'd encountered would become hunted, studied, destroyed by human attention. No, I couldn't tell. I couldn't share this. Not with anyone. We finished the course 2 days later on August 9th. I drove the students back to Troutdale, helped them unload their gear, accepted their thanks and promises to leave good reviews. Then I drove home to my small house outside Cascade Locks, a 40-minute drive that felt like hours. I walked in, dropped my pack by the door, and stood in my quiet living room feeling like a stranger in my own life. Everything looked the same. The couch I'd bought at a yard sale, the bookshelf full of field guides and wilderness manuals, the map of the Pacific Northwest on my wall with pins marking places I'd explored. But I wasn't the same person who'd left 5 days earlier. That person hadn't known these creatures existed. That person hadn't been trusted with an impossible secret. Over the next few days, I tried to return to normal life. I had another course scheduled for mid-August, a weekend basics class for beginners. I needed to prepare for it, check my equipment, review the lesson plan. But I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about what I'd seen, about that baby's eyes, about the mother's intelligence, about the touch on my shoulder. I needed to know more. I needed to understand what I'd encountered. I started researching, something I'd never seriously done before. I read everything I could find about Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest. There were hundreds of reports, thousands when you included all of North America. Most were easy to dismiss, vague descriptions, obvious hoaxes, misidentifications of known animals. But some were different. Some described encounters that matched what I'd experienced. Witnesses talking about the intelligence in the eyes, the almost human expressions, the way they moved with purpose and awareness. One report from 1976, from a logger working near Mount St. Helens, described finding a juvenile Sasquatch caught in a trap and freeing it. He wrote about how the young one called out and how an adult appeared within minutes, displaying what he called remarkable restraint given the circumstances. The adult had watched him free the young one, then led it away without aggression. I read that report 3 times, my heart pounding. It was almost exactly what had happened to me 31 years later. I found academic papers by a few scientists who took the subject seriously. Dr. Grover Krantz, an anthropologist from Washington State University who died in 2002, had argued that Bigfoot could theoretically exist based on the fossil record of Gigantopithecus, a giant ape that lived in Asia until around 100,000 years ago. His theories suggested that a relict population could have crossed the Bering Land Bridge and survived in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, evolving adaptations for the climate and terrain. Other researchers had done serious analysis of footprint casts, finding anatomical details that would be nearly impossible for a hoaxer to fake. Consistent mid-tarsal breaks, dermal ridges, variations in toe positions. The more I read, the more I realized I wasn't alone in believing these creatures existed. There was a small but dedicated community of researchers who'd been gathering evidence for decades, facing ridicule and skepticism, but persisting because they knew the truth. But I also found darker things. Stories of hunters who'd allegedly shot and killed Sasquatch, only to have government agents confiscate the bodies. Rumors of secret government programs monitoring these creatures, keeping their existence classified for reasons that varied from national security to preventing public panic. I read accounts from indigenous peoples across North America, dozens of tribes who had names for these beings and considered them part of the natural world. not mythical but simply another species sharing the forest. The Lummi called them Tsemiques, the Coast Salish called them Saskets, the Spokane called them Siatik. And in all these traditions there was a consistent message. These beings were to be respected, left alone, not hunted or harmed. 2 weeks after my encounter, I decided I needed to go back. Not to the same spot that felt like a violation, but to the general area. I needed to see if I could find any other evidence, any signs of these creatures. I took a personal day, telling my boss at Pacific Northwest Expeditions that I was scouting potential new locations for future courses. I drove back to Gifford Pinchot, parked at a different trailhead, and hiked into the wilderness alone. I spent 3 days out there, covering maybe 30 miles of terrain, looking for signs. Unusual footprints, tree breaks, the stick structures some researchers claimed were territorial markers. I found nothing definitive, though on the second day I came across a print in soft mud next to a stream that made me stop and stare. It was large, at least 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes and what looked like a mid-foot break. I took photographs from every angle, measured it carefully, made a sketch in my field notebook, but I didn't make a cast, didn't mark the location with GPS coordinates. That would have been evidence I'd have to decide what to do with, and I still wasn't ready for that. On the third evening, as I was setting up camp in a small clearing, I had the distinct sensation of being watched. The forest had gone quiet, that unnatural silence that usually meant a predator was nearby. I froze, listening, my hand moving slowly toward the bear spray on my belt. Nothing moved. No sound except my own breathing. But the feeling persisted, that prickling awareness on the back of your neck that comes from being observed. "I know you're there," I said quietly, not sure if I was being ridiculous talking to the trees. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm not here to expose you. I just want to understand." Silence. But the quality of it changed somehow, became less oppressive. And then, so faint I almost missed it, I heard a sound. That same vocalization the baby had made, high-pitched, almost bird-like. It came from somewhere in the trees to my left, maybe 50 yards away. I turned toward it slowly, trying to see movement in the deepening shadows. "Thank you," I said, not sure what else to say, not even sure what I was thanking them for. Existing, trusting me enough to let me know they were watching, for not seeing me as a threat. The vocalization came again, slightly different, and then nothing. The forest's normal sounds gradually returned. Crickets, an owl calling in the distance, the rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth. Whatever had been watching me was gone, or had decided I was no longer interesting. I lay in my sleeping bag that night, staring up at the stars visible through gaps in the canopy, thinking about what my life had become. 2 weeks ago, I'd been a wilderness survival instructor with a straightforward worldview. Now I was a man keeping an impossible secret, spending my free time searching for evidence of creatures that science insisted didn't exist, having one-sided conversations with the forest and hearing responses that might be real or might be wishful thinking. I felt unmoored, adrift between the world of rational explanation and the reality of what I'd experienced. When I returned to Cascade Locks, I found an email waiting from Patricia, the nurse who'd been on the survival course. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to talk to her brother about the local wildlife. He was planning a camping trip in the area and wanted some advice on good locations. I wrote back with a polite excuse saying I was booked solid for the next few months. The last thing I needed was some cryptozoology enthusiast following me around, asking questions, trying to find evidence. I'd become protective of these creatures in a way I didn't fully understand. They'd trusted me in their way. The mother could have killed me easily, but she'd chosen not to. She'd acknowledged what I'd done for her baby. That meant something. That created an obligation. Over the following months, I developed a routine. I'd lead my regular survival courses, teach my students about fire making and shelter construction and edible plants. And in between, on my days off, I'd return to Gifford Pinchot. Not to the same locations. I varied my routes and explored different drainages and valleys. Sometimes I'd find things that made me wonder, trees with bark stripped at heights no bear could reach, rock piles that didn't look natural, the occasional footprint that was too large, too humanoid, but nothing as definitive as that day in August, nothing that would convince anyone else. And then one day in the late October, 3 months after the drowning incident, I was hiking along a ridge about 10 miles from where I'd first encountered the baby when I found something that changed everything again. There was a small shelter built against a rock face, constructed from branches and bark and moss. But it wasn't a human shelter. The scale was all wrong. Everything was too large, built for something much bigger than a person. And inside the shelter, arranged carefully on a flat rock, was an offering. Fresh huckleberries in a rough basket made from woven cedar bark. Wild mushrooms I recognized as chanterelles, highly prized and delicious. And in the center of the arrangement, gleaming in the filtered sunlight, was a smooth river stone, perfectly round, about the size of my fist. I knelt down at the entrance to the shelter, my heart pounding. This was deliberate. Someone had left this here, and given the location, the scale of the shelter, there was only one explanation for who that someone could be. But why? Why leave food and a stone in an abandoned shelter? Unless it wasn't abandoned, unless it was meant to be found. I reached out slowly and picked up the stone. It was beautiful, polished smooth by countless years in running water, a deep gray color with veins of white quartz running through it. The kind of thing you might pick up on a riverbank and pocket because it was too perfect to leave behind. And as I turned it over in my hands, I understood. This was a gift. This was reciprocity. I'd helped one of them, and now they were helping me, offering food, offering acknowledgement, offering a connection. I sat there for a long time, holding that stone, looking at the berries and mushrooms. Finally, I carefully took a few of the berries, leaving most of them. I took one mushroom and I left something of my own. I had a red bandana in my pack, clean, never used. I folded it carefully and placed it on the rock where the stone had been. A gift for a gift, a signal that I understood, that I accepted this strange relationship we'd formed. I hiked out of the forest that day with the stone in my pocket, and it's sitting on my desk right now as I tell this story. Physical evidence that it all really happened, that I'm not crazy or delusional, though I suppose a river stone proves nothing to anyone but me. It's just a rock. Anyone could have left it. Any explanation is more plausible than the truth, but I know what I know. I held that baby in my arms. I looked into its mother's eyes. I found their shelter and their gifts. And over the 3 years since then, I've had 4 more encounters, brief ones, always at a distance. A figure watching from a tree line, a sound in the darkness just outside my camp. Once, an entire family group, I counted 5 individuals crossing a meadow at dawn while I watched from concealment half a mile away through binoculars. Each time I've felt that same sense of being evaluated, accepted, allowed to witness something precious. I still lead survival courses. I still teach people how to live in the wilderness. But now I have a secondary purpose. I watch the forests. I pay attention to patterns. And when I see evidence that these creatures are nearby, I quietly discourage people from exploring those areas. I suggest alternate campsites, recommend different trails, always with plausible reasons that have nothing to do with the truth. I've become a guardian of sorts, protecting a secret that's not mine to share. There are times I want to tell someone, anyone. The weight of keeping this inside is crushing. But then I think about what would happen if the world knew. The hunters who'd come looking for trophies, the scientists who'd want to capture and study them, the tourists who'd flood into their habitat with cameras and drones. These creatures have survived for thousands of years by staying hidden, by avoiding human contact. Who am I to destroy that? One moment of attention-seeking, one desire for validation, and I could doom an entire species. So I stay silent, and I keep watching, and I carry that river stone in my pocket whenever I go into the forests. A reminder of the day I saved a baby Bigfoot from drowning and its mother touched my shoulder in gratitude. Everything changed again in March of 2020. The world was changing too in ways none of us could have predicted. COVID-19 had just been declared a pandemic. Oregon issued stay-at-home orders. My survival courses were canceled indefinitely. Pacific Northwest expeditions furloughed most of the staff, including me. Suddenly, I had nothing but time and an empty forest that fewer people than ever were visiting. I should have been worried about money, about my future, about the virus. But instead, I felt a strange sense of relief. For 3 years, I'd been splitting my life between the normal world and the secret one, between teaching people and protecting creatures that weren't supposed to exist. Now, with society shutting down, I could focus entirely on the latter. I bought enough supplies to last months, loaded my truck, and drove back into Gifford Pinchot with no intention of leaving anytime soon. I set up a semi-permanent camp in a remote valley I'd discovered the previous fall, about 20 miles from the nearest road. It was a beautiful spot, protected on 3 sides by steep ridges with a clear creek running through the center. I'd found evidence of Sasquatch activity there before, tree breaks, footprints, that distinctive musky scent that lingered in certain areas. I built a solid shelter, not the temporary debris huts I taught students to make, but a proper structure with a frame of lashed poles and a roof of cedar bark and pine boughs. I set up a bear hang for my food, established a proper latrine away from the water source, created a rock-lined fire pit. This wasn't a camping trip. This was a homestead, temporary but serious. For the first 2 weeks, I saw nothing unusual. I fell into a rhythm of camp maintenance, exploring the surrounding terrain, fishing in the creek, gathering wild edibles. The forest in early spring was awakening. Avalanche lilies pushing through the last patches of snow, birds returning from their winter migrations, bears emerging from their dens. I'd wake with the sun, spend the days hiking and observing, return to camp as dusk fell. It was the most peace I'd felt since that day in August of 2017. On the 15th day, I was returning to camp just before sunset when I noticed something wrong. My bear hang had been taken down, not torn down by a bear that would have left claw marks on the tree, scattered food everywhere. This had been carefully lowered, the rope untied from where I'd secured it, not cut. The food bag was sitting on the ground, unopened. And next to it was an arrangement of objects I hadn't left there. 3 perfect pine cones placed in a triangle, a bundle of young fiddlehead ferns still fresh, a bird's nest empty but intact, woven with incredible precision. And in the center of this arrangement, another river stone, this one smaller than the first, a deep red color with bands of gold. My heart started pounding. They'd been here. They'd been in my camp while I was gone. They'd touched my things, examined my setup, left another gift. I looked around quickly, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. The forest was quiet except for the normal evening sounds. Thrushes singing their twilight songs, the creek murmuring over stones. I knelt down and picked up the stone, feeling its weight, its smoothness. The message was clear. They knew I was here. They'd accepted my presence, and they wanted to continue this strange communication we'd established. I gathered up the pine cones and ferns, left my own offerings in return, a handful of trail mix, some dried fruit, a small mirror from my pack that might fascinate them with its reflections. Then I moved my camp to a different spot, about 100 yards away. If they were visiting, I didn't want my shelter to be an obstacle. I wanted to give them space, show them I understood the boundaries. Over the next 3 weeks, the exchanges continued. I'd leave camp for a few hours, and when I returned, there would be new gifts. Interesting rocks, unusual pieces of wood shaped by water and time, once a deer antler shed that was still fresh, the bone white and clean. I left my own offerings in return, always careful not to leave anything that could harm them. No processed foods with salt or sugar, no plastics, nothing artificial. I left natural things, dried fish from the creek, wild onions I'd gathered, carved pieces of wood that I'd worked with my knife during the long evenings. And then, on a morning in early April, everything escalated. I woke to find something sitting directly outside my shelter entrance. Not the usual arrangement of gifts on the communal stone we'd been using. This was personal, deliberate. It was a woven basket about the size of a dinner plate, made from cedar bark with incredible skill. The weaving was so tight it could have held water. And inside the basket were fresh trout, 3 of them, already cleaned and ready to cook. The heads and guts had been buried nearby. I could see the disturbed earth. This wasn't just a gift. This was food sharing. This was trust on an entirely new level. I cooked those trout that morning, and they were the best meal I'd had in weeks. As I ate, I thought about what this meant. They were providing for me. In indigenous traditions I'd read about, Sasquatch were sometimes described as protectors, beings who would leave food for lost travelers or people in need. Was that what was happening here? Did they see me as someone under their protection? The idea was humbling and overwhelming. That afternoon, I decided to try something bold. I took my notebook, the waterproof field journal I always carried, and drew a picture. I'm not an artist, but I drew the best representation I could of what had happened 3 years ago. The creek, the pool, the baby drowning, me pulling it out, the mother appearing. I used colored pencils to make it clearer. Blue for water, brown for the creatures, yellow for me in my shirt. Then I placed the open notebook on the communal stone, weighted down with smaller rocks so the wind wouldn't flip the pages. I left camp and hiked up to a ridge about half a mile away, where I could observe the area through my binoculars. I waited for 3 hours, barely moving, watching the stone and the notebook. The shadows were getting long, and I was about to give up when I saw movement. A figure emerged from the forest on the far side of the clearing. Even at this distance, I could tell it was large, maybe 7 feet tall, moving with that characteristic fluid grace I'd witnessed before. It approached the stone cautiously, looking around, clearly aware that this might be observed. It was a male, I thought, based on the build. Broad shoulders, more muscular than the mother I'd seen before. He reached the stone and looked down at the notebook. For a long moment, he just stood there, and I wondered if he could understand what he was seeing, if the concept of two-dimensional representation meant anything to him. Then he knelt down, and through the binoculars, I could see him carefully turning pages. He went back and forth several times between different pages, comparing them. And then he did something that made my breath catch. He picked up one of my colored pencils, the brown one, and he drew something on a blank page. His movements were awkward, clearly unfamiliar with holding such a small tool, but deliberate. When he finished, he placed the pencil back carefully, closed the notebook, and left it on the stone. Then he stood, looked directly toward the ridge where I was hiding, even though there was no way he should have been able to see me at that distance, and raised one hand in what looked unmistakably like a wave. I waited until he disappeared back into the forest, then practically ran down the ridge to the stone. My hands were shaking as I picked up the notebook and opened it to where he'd drawn. It was crude, simple, but absolutely clear. He'd drawn two figures, one large and one small. The large one had its hand on the small one's head, a protective gesture, and next to them, separate but close, was a third figure drawn in a different shade, the yellow pencil I'd used for myself. Me. He'd drawn a picture of himself with the baby and included me. We were separate but together, different but connected. I sat down hard on the ground, the notebook clutched in my hands. This was communication, real, intentional communication with a non-human intelligence. I was engaging in a dialogue with a species that science didn't believe existed, and that dialogue was happening through drawings and gifs and silent understanding. The implications were staggering. If they could understand representational art, if they could create it themselves, that indicated cognitive abilities on par with humans. This wasn't just an unknown primate. This was a culture, a civilization that had chosen to remain hidden from us. That night, I lay in my shelter, unable to sleep, my mind racing. I thought about all the researchers who'd spent decades searching for evidence, setting up trail cameras, organizing expeditions, and here I was, having a conversation through drawings with one of these beings. Why me? What had made them choose to trust me? Was it really just because I'd saved the baby, or was there something else? Maybe they'd been watching me for years, observing my survival courses, seeing how I treated the forest, how I taught respect for nature. Maybe I'd been evaluated long before that day at the creek. The following morning, I drew more pictures. I drew the forest, the mountains, the creek. I drew myself in different seasons, showing that I came and went, that I didn't live here permanently. I tried to communicate that I understood this was their home, not mine, that I was a visitor. I left the notebook open to these new drawings and went to fish upstream. When I returned, there were new drawings. They were better than mine, more skilled, despite the unfamiliar medium. He'd drawn the forest at night, showing multiple figures gathered in a clearing. A family group, I realized. He'd drawn a shelter similar to the one I'd found the previous October, but more detailed, showing the construction technique. And on another page, he'd drawn something that looked like a warning. Human figures with what could only be guns, pointing them towards Sasquatch figures. The message was clear. There were others of my kind who were dangerous. He was acknowledging the risk they were taking by communicating with me. This exchange continued for another week. Each day, new drawings, new messages. He drew maps of the area, showing me territories I hadn't explored. He drew plants and marked some with what looked like an X, while circling others. Poison versus edible, I realized. He was teaching me about the forest, sharing knowledge his people had accumulated over generations. I drew questions, drew myself pointing at things with a question mark beside them. He answered when he could, drew more details, expanded on concepts. And then one morning, I came back to find not drawings, but a note. Not written in English, but in symbols, a form of written language I'd never seen before. The characters were angular, precise, made up of lines and dots arranged in patterns. It was clearly structured, clearly systematic. They had writing, an entire written language that no human had ever documented. I stared at that page for an hour, trying to find patterns, trying to understand. But without a key, without someone to teach me, it was impossible to decode. The next day, I tried to respond. I wrote the English alphabet on a page, then drew pictures of simple objects next to words. Tree, rock, water, fish. Basic nouns, trying to establish a vocabulary bridge. When I returned, he'd added the Sasquatch symbols next to my words. I had the beginning of a translation guide. Over the following days, we expanded it. Verbs, adjectives, numbers. He was teaching me his language, and I was teaching him mine. It was slow, painstaking, limited by the medium of paper and pencil, but it was working. On April 28th, exactly 6 weeks after I'd established my camp, something unprecedented happened. I was sitting by my fire in the early evening, cooking dinner, when I heard that familiar vocalization, the high-pitched call that the baby had made 3 years ago. But this time it came from the edge of my clearing, maybe 50 feet away. I turned slowly, and there they were. The mother and the baby, except the baby wasn't a baby anymore. It was half-grown, maybe 5 feet tall now, ganglier, fur still lighter than its mother's. They stood at the forest edge watching me. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. This was the closest they'd ever come while I was present. Every other encounter had been at a distance or while I was away. Now they were here, visible, vulnerable, choosing to show themselves. The mother made a soft sound, almost like a rumble, and the young one took a hesitant step forward. I remained absolutely still, barely breathing, letting them control the interaction. The young one took another step, then another. It was looking at me with those same intelligent eyes I remembered, now set in a more mature face. It was studying me, remembering me, I thought. Could it remember being pulled from the water 3 years ago? Did Sasquatch have that kind of long-term memory? Based on everything I'd learned, I believed they did. It crossed half the distance to my fire, about 25 feet, then stopped. The mother stayed at the tree line, watching intently, ready to intervene if needed. The young one reached into a pouch it wore, a leather bag tied around its waist, and pulled something out. It held the object up so I could see it clearly in the firelight. It was a carving made from what looked like maple wood. A small figure, crude but recognizable. A human figure, me. The young one placed the carving on the ground, midway between us, then backed away slowly. It returned to its mother, who placed a hand on its shoulder, a proud gesture. Then they both turned and melted back into the forest, leaving me alone with the fire and the carving and the understanding of what had just happened. The young one had made something for me, had carved a representation of me out of wood, probably working on it for days or weeks. This wasn't just communication. This was art, symbolism, the creation of meaning. This was gratitude expressed in a way that transcended species. I walked over and picked up the carving, turning it over in my hands. It was smooth, well-made, the proportions surprisingly accurate. I could see where small tools had been used, stone blades maybe, to shape the wood. Hours of work had gone into this. Hours of thinking about me, about what I'd done, about how to express thanks. I sat by the fire until it burned down to coals, holding that carving, crying openly in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child. The weight of isolation I'd been carrying for 3 years, the burden of the secret, the loneliness of knowing something the rest of the world refused to believe. It all came pouring out. But mixed with the sadness was joy, profound joy at being accepted by these beings, at being seen not as a threat, but as something else, an ally, a friend, someone worthy of trust and art and gifts. The next morning, I made a decision. I carved something of my own. I wasn't as skilled as the young Sasquatch, but I'd learned basic wood carving over the years, and I worked for 3 days straight, getting it right. I carved 3 figures, the mother, the young one, and me, standing together. I made us all the same size in the carving, equalizing us, showing that I saw them not as animals or curiosities, but as people. Different people, but people nonetheless. I placed the carving on the communal stone with a note written in both English and the Sasquatch symbols I'd learned. Thank you. Friend, protect. When I checked the next day, my carving was gone, but in its place was something that made me sit down hard, in shock. It was a detailed map drawn on bark, showing a vast area of the forest. Different symbols marked different locations, and using the vocabulary we'd established, I could understand some of them. Family groups, winter shelters, sacred places, and one symbol, repeated in several locations, that translated to danger. Places where humans came with guns, places where their people had been killed or injured. They were showing me their entire territory, trusting me with information that could destroy them if it fell into the wrong hands. But there was more. At the bottom of the bark map, drawn with careful precision, was a location marked with a new symbol, one we hadn't defined in our vocabulary exchanges. Next to it was a drawing of the moon, full and then crescent, suggesting time passing, and next to that, a drawing of me and multiple Sasquatch figures, an invitation. They wanted me to meet them somewhere specific at a certain time. I studied the map, translating the location to my own mental geography of the area. It was a valley about 8 miles northwest of my camp, a place I'd never explored. The moon phases suggested timing, and doing the math, I figured out they meant 21 days from now. May 19th, 2020. They wanted me to come to a gathering. They wanted to introduce me to their community. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. I made sure I had appropriate gifts to bring. I practiced their language symbols, expanding my vocabulary through continued notebook exchanges. I learned their word for gratitude, for peace, for family. I learned how to write my own name in their script, how to introduce myself properly. The male who'd been drawing with me, I'd started thinking of him as the teacher, left increasingly complex messages. He told me about their customs through pictures and symbols, how to show respect, how to approach without threatening, what gestures meant aggression and what meant friendship. On the morning of May 19th, I woke before dawn, nerves making sleep impossible. I packed carefully, gifts, my notebook, water, some food, no knife, no tools that could be seen as weapons. I wanted to come as harmless as possible. I hiked to the designated location, following the map, reaching the valley around mid-morning. It was beautiful, a hidden place where the forest opened into a natural meadow, maybe 2 acres across, surrounded by old-growth cedar and hemlock. A stream ran along one edge, and the new grass was brilliant green in the spring sunlight. And in the center of the meadow, they were waiting. Not just the mother and young one, not just the teacher. There were at least 20 of them. Families from elders with silver gray fur to infants clinging to their mothers. The full spectrum of their community, exposed and vulnerable, trusting me not to betray them. I stopped at the edge of the meadow, overwhelmed. An elder male, bigger than any I'd seen before, at least 8.5 feet tall with a bearing that radiated authority, stepped forward. He vocalized something, a complex series of sounds that I couldn't replicate. Then the teacher came forward and gestured for me to approach. My legs felt weak, but I walked into the meadow toward the center where they'd gathered. The young one I'd rescued ran up to me, and before I could react, it hugged me, just threw its arms around me in an embrace that was completely unmistakably human in its emotion. I hugged back, this being that was now taller than me, and felt its mother approach from behind. She placed her hand on my head, the way the teacher had drawn in his picture, a blessing or a welcome. Then she vocalized to the group, and I heard my name in the sounds, the phonemes they'd learned from our exchanges. Nathan. What followed was the most extraordinary day of my life. They brought me into their circle, literally sitting me down among them. The elder approached and examined me closely, looking at my hands, my face, even smelling me, I think establishing his own assessment of who and what I was. Then he made a gesture that the teacher helped translate through drawn symbols. Welcome. You are witnessed. You are known. They shared food with me, offering me berries and roots and even some kind of prepared fish that was far better than anything I'd cooked. The children, and there were 5 of them in various stages of youth, were curious and bold, coming up to touch my clothes, my hair, fascinated by the strange human in their midst. The adults watched carefully but didn't interfere, letting the young ones satisfy their curiosity. I noticed that several of the adults had scars, old injuries that suggested hard lives. One elderly female was missing part of her left hand, the fingers gone. probably lost to a trap or accident long ago. Through the day, they showed me things. They demonstrated their tool use, showing me stone blades they'd crafted, techniques for processing plant fibers into rope, methods for preserving food. The teacher brought out examples of their written language, symbols carved into pieces of bark and wood, a library of sorts. He showed me what I interpreted as records, histories maybe, or important events marked down for future generations. They had culture, history, art, technology. Everything we associate with civilization, just expressed differently, lived differently, hidden from human eyes. As the afternoon wore on, the elder approached me again. This time, he drew in the dirt, showing me something I had to see to believe. A timeline of sorts, marked with phases of the moon going back what looked like hundreds of cycles. And along that timeline, drawings of humans. Not modern humans, but older ones, dressed differently, carrying different tools. Indigenous peoples, I realized. He was showing me that his people had witnessed the entire human history of this continent. They'd been here when the first peoples crossed the Bering Strait. They'd been here through the rise and fall of countless human generations. They'd watched us arrive, spread, change, always adapting their own behavior to avoid us. He drew more, showing conflict, humans with spears attacking Sasquatch. He showed cooperation, trade, even what looked like shared ceremonies. The relationship between our species had been complex, filled with both violence and peace. But in recent centuries, the violence had won out. Too many humans, too many guns, too little wilderness. His people had made the decision to disappear completely, to become myth, to survive through invisibility. Until now, until me. The teacher added more drawings explaining why they'd chosen to reveal themselves. Their numbers were declining, he showed me, each generation smaller than the last. Fewer places to live safely, less food as forests were cut down, sickness from pollution. They were facing extinction, and they knew it. By showing themselves to me, by establishing communication, they were taking a desperate gamble. Maybe one human who understood, who cared, could help somehow, could protect their territory, could keep others away, could give them a few more generations to survive. The responsibility of that hit me like a physical weight. They weren't just sharing their existence with me. They were asking for help. They were trusting me to be their advocate in a world that would either dismiss them as fantasy or hunt them to destruction if it knew the truth. How could I help? I was nobody, just a survival instructor living in Oregon. I had no power, no influence, no ability to protect thousands of acres of forest from development or logging. But I could do something. I could keep this territory secret. I could discourage people from exploring this area. I could be their silent guardian, their unknown protector. I drew my response, trying to communicate what I was willing to do. I drew myself standing between their territory and human encroachment. I drew an X over the symbols for danger. I drew us, them, and me together facing forward, partners, allies. I couldn't promise to solve their problems, but I could promise to try. I could promise to keep their secret and use whatever limited influence I had to preserve their home. The elder studied my drawings for a long time. Then he did something I'll never forget. He took my hand in his massive one, gentle despite his strength, and placed it over his heart. I felt the beating there, steady and strong. Then he took my other hand and placed it on the young one's head, the child I'd saved 3 years ago. The message was clear. You are part of our family now. What you did mattered. Who you are matters. We trust you with our lives. As the sun began to set, they prepared to leave. Families gathered their children. Elders were helped to their feet by younger adults. The teacher gave me one final drawing, a map even more detailed than before. showing locations I should avoid because they used them regularly, and other locations where I could camp safely if I needed to return. He also gave me a gift, a beautifully carved necklace made from wood and bone, with a pendant showing a hand, human and Sasquatch, clasped together. I put it on immediately and have worn it every day since. The young one hugged me again before leaving, and its mother touched my shoulder one more time, the same gesture she'd made 3 years earlier. Then, one by one, they disappeared back into the forest, until I was alone in the meadow with the evening light fading and the weight of everything I'd experienced settling over me like a blanket. I made it back to my camp as full dark fell, exhausted emotionally and physically. I stayed in the forest for another 2 weeks, but I didn't see them again. Our exchanges on the communal stone continued, brief notes and small gifts, but the major contact had happened. They'd shown me what they wanted me to see, said what they needed to say. Now it was up to me to figure out how to live with this knowledge and honor the trust they'd placed in me. In June of 2020, I finally left the forest and returned to Cascade Locks. The world had changed during my time away. The pandemic was in full force, businesses closed, people wearing masks, society fundamentally altered. But I'd changed too, in ways far more profound. I wasn't the same person who'd driven into those woods 3 months earlier. I'd been accepted by another species. I'd been trusted with the knowledge of their existence, their culture, their desperate situation. I'd been given a responsibility I could never put down. Pacific Northwest expeditions eventually reopened, and I went back to teaching survival courses. But everything was different now. When I led students through the forests, I was constantly aware of who else might be watching. I changed my routes to avoid the territories marked on the map. I taught my students about respecting wildlife, about moving through nature with humility and awareness, but I was really teaching them how to avoid disturbing the neighbors they didn't know existed. I became paranoid about trail cameras, about drone usage, about anyone who seemed too interested in cryptozoology. I shot down every conversation about Bigfoot with practiced skepticism, becoming the world's biggest denier while knowing the truth intimately. At night, I'd take out that carved figure the young one had made, the map on bark, the necklace the teacher gave me. Physical evidence that I wasn't crazy, that it had all really happened. And I'd think about what it meant to be trusted by beings who had every reason to fear and hate humanity. We'd driven them to the edge of extinction. We'd taken their forests, polluted their streams, shot at them when they were seen. And yet they'd chosen to trust me, to believe that at least one human could be different, could be worthy of the honor they'd given me. I'm 45 years old now, and I've kept this secret for 3 years since that day in the meadow. 7 years since I first pulled that baby from the water. I still return to the forests regularly, still find occasional messages on the communal stone, still see evidence that they're surviving, adapting, holding on. Their population hasn't declined further as far as I can tell. Maybe our arrangement is helping. My quiet protection of their territory, my subtle redirection of human traffic away from their core areas. Or maybe they're just resilient, these incredible beings who've survived against all odds. I've thought many times about going public, about revealing what I know. The scientific value would be immense. The proof that an unknown great ape species exists in North America would revolutionize primatology, anthropology, ecology. But every time I consider it, I think about that elder placing my hand over his heart. I think about the young one who carved my figure out of maple wood. I think about the mother who touched my shoulder in gratitude, rather than tearing me apart for touching her baby. They trusted me, and that trust is worth more than any fame or validation I might get from revelation. So I stay silent and I keep watching, and I honor the responsibility they gave me. I am the guardian of the greatest secret in natural history, the keeper of a trust that spans species, The human who knows that we are not alone in these forests and never have been. The world thinks Bigfoot is a myth, and I let them think that, because the alternative would be the end of everything I was shown, everything I was given, everything I promised to protect. On my desk right now, next to my computer, sits that smooth river stone they left me 7 years ago. Next to it is the carved figure of me that the young one made. And around my neck, hidden under my shirt, where nobody can see it, is the necklace showing 2 hands clasped together. Reminders of the day I saved a baby Bigfoot from drowning, of what its mother did next, of the community that welcomed me, of the responsibility I carry. And I will carry this secret to my grave, because some truths are too precious to share, and some promises are too sacred to break. They showed me that intelligence, compassion, and culture exist beyond humanity. And in doing so, they taught me what it really means to be human. To protect rather than exploit. To honor trust rather than seek glory. To be worthy of the faith placed in us by those who have no reason to offer it. That is the real shock of what the mother did. Not that she touched my shoulder, but that she trusted me at all, and in doing so, changed my life forever.